I want to thank Antonia, Melinda, and the entire team at Change Catalyst for not only putting on this event, but creating a space for myself and other speakers to share our experiences and our ideas. And I think it's really important to create spaces for this, especially for marginalized and minority groups. So with that being said, give me a second here while I figure out how to show my screen. To talk a little bit about, my tech journey as a triple minority. So hopefully you can see my screen here. Can someone keep me honest? Can you see my screen okay?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. So I want to start off by saying, as I go through my presentation today, I want to point out that I've mixed up the stories to the organizations that I referenced today to be respectful of the organizations that I previously worked for. And so with that being said, my agenda today is first, how do I define an underrepresented group? And then to humanize our conversation today, I want to share with you a little bit about who I am outside of my professional life as a solutions engineer, and then start to share, my work history and stories and experiences that I've had through the tech industry, and really focusing on microaggression and unconscious bias. And then lastly, share some insights into what has helped me get through these challenges. Now, I do want to note, I specifically added my dog Dozer here to the presentation for the mere fact that he's part of an underrepresented group as well in terms of breed, and he gets discriminated quite often. So I just wanted to give him a little love there. So with that being said, what is my definition of an underrepresented group? As it pertains to the workforce, my definition would be anyone that doesn't fall under the category of able-bodied heterosexual cis male. Now, I work with folks that fall both in the major category and also minority groups here. Now, I also want to point out that these groups and so many others experience discrimination, and I just want to make sure to acknowledge that. We have things in and above ethnic background, gender, sexuality. There was a presentation about ableism, both seen and unseen, ageism, religion, so many other categories that get discriminated against. But for today, I really want to talk about the 3 first bulleted points because that's where my personal experiences come from, at least for today's presentation. So, how do I identify? I identify as a queer, Asian, masculine, of-center woman. And I think it's really important to learn the difference between identifying and labeling. Now, we've all been conditioned to label people to what we think they should be categorized as, rather than letting people label themselves and telling us what their preferences are. Now, I'll use myself as a prime example. People look at me and they think, and I've been told to my face, I'm butch or you're butch. And in reality, that's not actually how I identify, and that's not a label that actually resonates with me. So simply saying, just give people the space and room to tell us how they identify it, or maybe pick up on some cues before we immediately label others. And if you don't know, just ask. It's that simple. Now, a little bit about myself. My name is Teresa Doe. Everyone calls me Tito. It's literally my first initial, my last name. I've been going by Tito for about 20 years now, and I'm a senior solutions engineer at Gladly. And to personalize this experience, I want to share a little bit about the sum of my parts. Essentially, the 3 core pillars that keep me vertical and a sane human being. First is my mom. She is literally my superhero. Secondly, my 2 dogs, Ruby and Dozer. They have taught me the lessons of unconditional love, being present, and patience. And I'm underscoring patience. And then lastly, my partner, Danny. She is my adventure partner. She goes with any travel idea that I might have. She also backs me out of a lot of ideas that I might have because it's quite necessary, and she absolutely keeps me grounded. Now, I want to talk and focus more on my mother because she is that person that framed up my definition of work. And she's faced her own exclusion in her lifetime as well. Now, my mom immigrated during the war, leaving her 8 siblings and her mother behind. And in the midst of bombs dropping, a US naval ship came, picked her up, and basically shipped her out to Guam, where she was a refugee for 6 months, and then landing in California afterwards. 2 years later, she had me. And as a single mother, she worked 3 jobs to provide a roof over our heads, food for us to eat, and was able to afford private school for myself. And As a kid, I never felt like I missed out on anything. And it wasn't until I entered the workforce that I really understood the sacrifices that she made to ensure that I had a good life. And this includes putting her life at risk. Now, it wouldn't be for another 26 years that she'd ever see her family again and her dying mother. Now, I bring this up because her work ethic are second to none, and she really instilled the importance of work. And as I grew older, I realized the expectations were really high, not because of any pressures my mom put on me other than, succeeding in school, but because I knew I had no safety net. I was an only child with no siblings. The only family I had here was my mom, no uncles, no aunts. So failure was not an option. And so, with that being said, I entered my second year of school while studying sociology. And while in school, I started working for a financial institution of all things as a temp at a Fortune 500 company. And that was just pure luck. I needed to work to contribute to the family. I went to a temp agency and they just happened to pair us up. And I eventually grew into a full role at this company and ended up staying with them for almost a decade. Unfortunately, this is where I first experienced workplace aggression. Now, to give you some context in how I moved within this professional space at this organization, I was completely out as a queer person. I had a pretty good, and consistent performance reviews, and I made some really great friendships there. However, on one particular Christmas, I received a Bible as a gift with a handwritten note inside that basically read, "I hope you follow the path of God." Now, not only was this insulting because this person had no idea what my religious beliefs were, but this was coming from a director level person that was well known for her religious beliefs. And regardless, I was really dumbfounded and confused. Why would anyone give me a Bible? And it had nothing to do with my work, and it had nothing to do around the conversations that I wasn't having about my own religious beliefs. It was almost as if I was walking around with horns, protruding from my forehead. And this was my first experience of outright work aggression. And I want to pause really quickly to define what work aggression is. And it's pretty self-explanatory in the sense that it's aggression that happens in the workplace. But I think we need to peel back that first layer of the onion and understand that workplace aggression can also include a wide range of behaviors, ranging from, verbal acts to physical attacks, or things like this in the story I just mentioned. And I think leaders have to understand that workplace aggression can decrease the ability of a person to do their job and to do it well. And as a human being, it leads to physical declines in health and mental and emotional problems as well. Now, I bring all of this up to basically highlight what I consider to be an even scarier type of aggression in the workplace, which would be microaggression. Now, I'm not going to spend time reading the slide to you, but I do want to focus on this bottom area here in terms that microaggression is that indirect, subtle, unintentional discrimination against members of a specific group, in this case, marginalized group. And I think this is even more dangerous than the outright aggression because it's unintentional and it's unconscious. And one of the unfortunate consequences in that is that the perpetrators are actually well-intentioned people, and they might be people that have close relationships with, and they're really unaware of the hidden messages being communicated to you. So the question here is, how do we address, microaggressions? Now, before I talk about the solution, let me share another experience to highlight an instance of microaggression. About 18 years ago, I just aged myself. I got my foot in the door at my first tech startup, and I started as a tech support engineer, sitting behind a support desk, and eventually grew into an SE role, and then started to manage the solutions engineer on the SMB space. And I quickly discovered how much I really love being an SE from that moment to this day. And not to pat myself on the back, but if you'll give me this brief moment, I just want to say that I killed it. And I found myself with consistent winning records at really high volumes. And I was so proud of my work there, and I still am. Now, being an SE, I was paired up with a few different reps, and that's just how it works. And there's this one rep that really stood out to me, and he still stands out in my mind today. Now, in working with him, I try to strategize with him on deals, and he'd always suggest, get so-and-so involved. And by so-and-so, insert a male colleague's name. Now, keep in mind, even with a winning record, he'd start to delegate trivial tasks to me to do, which felt more like busy work than contributing meaningfully to closing deals. Now, he's a really nice guy, but this was his pattern. For every single deal we engaged on, it was always, can you check with so-and-so to see what he thinks? I spent so many nights thinking about my communication style with him, what I might have done to cause him to not want to interact with me in the same way that he interacted with my colleagues. Then it started to occur to me that I wasn't the problem. The problem was that the only visible difference between my colleagues and myself was my perceived gender. Now, this is a real life example of a microaggression, and let's just assume in this case it was due to gender. No one will really know, right? But in this case, it was two genders, same role, same obligations, different outcomes in terms of interactions. Now, how do we address microaggressions? Similar to workplace aggression, microaggressions can play a big role in employees' productivity. And if we really want to start solving the problem, companies and leaderships within the company, they really need to be aware and believe that microaggressions exist and that problem is a real thing. Randall Peterson, who's a professor of the organizational behavior and director of Leadership Institute of the London Business School, I think he put it perfectly. He basically said, the most productive response in workplace is actually to confront the microaggressor. Now, the key here is to approach the problem with a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. I know it may sound silly, but research has actually suggested if you're positive about the prospects of change in the person you confront, the more positive outcomes for both the perpetrator and the victim of the microaggression. Now, what are the similarities and differences between microaggression and implicit or unconscious bias? Now, for the most part, they're both unconscious. And as a refresher, a microaggression is that indirect or subtle discrimination against a member of a group. Whereas unconscious bias and implicit bias, now use these two terms interchangeably, is an unconscious attitude and stereotypes that can manifest in things like the workplace, school, criminal justice system, and so forth. Now, there are different types of implicit biases ranging from categories of race, gender, and sexuality. And these biases often arise as a result of really trying to navigate patterns of the overwhelming stimuli that we call the complicated world. So what I mean by that is things like culture, media, and even your upbringing can contribute to the development of these biases. And the truth is, removing these biases is challenging. It's especially challenging because we don't often know that they exist. And something to keep in mind here as well, just as a tidbit, is my belief is unconscious bias is nurtured by the language that we use. And I'm going to share another experience with you to help better articulate an implicit bias experience. Around this time, I was working at a really small startup, and I reported directly to the CEO and co-founder. I was so excited to hit the ground running because I worked really hard to reach this level and title in my career. And I remember an incident around Halloween. Now, for some context, Halloween was one of the company's favorite holidays. And so we went all out. During lunch breaks, during the week leading up to Halloween, we'd all go out and buy decorations. And some of the more tenured folks would pre-order huge items to get them delivered to the office, for decorations. And, we had a costume contest and, potlucks and ordered lunch together. And as we're celebrating that, as I'm sitting there around this table, I clearly recall a coworker handing me an envelope of receipts and asked me to divide the sum and get the payment from everyone for the decorations and the foods and all that. And, being the new kid at school, I was so happy to have a task and to contribute. But I was really curious and I blurted out, why me? With a straight face and direct eye contact, he said, Asians are really good at math and it won't take you long. To be fair, I have my moments. Sometimes I'm good at math and it's not because I'm Asian, it's because I love logic. And to be fair, sometimes I really suck at math. If you ask Danny for me, who pays the check, she does, because I cannot calculate tips for the life of me. But all that being said, this is an example of an implicit bias. And to call the elephant out in the room, this is pushing a little bit against racism, which is one of the downfalls of implicit bias. Now, how can we solve for implicit bias? As it pertains to the workplace, we really need to test our own unconscious bias and explore it. 3 things to think about is understand that unconscious bias is actually normal. The tendency is to think that having a bias, that makes us bad people. But neuroscience has shown that we're actually hardwired to prefer those who are familiar or have commonalities with us. Now, this is the key here is what makes biases bad is the lack of awareness in regard to how it might influence our decisions and impact others. The second point to think about is, try identifying your bias and their potential impact, right? Think about your own decision-making patterns and what biases might be happening there. Consider how these may play out in the workplace. How does unconscious bias affect the people you invite to a meeting? Who do you speak to more easily and whose opinions influence your own decision-making? And the last point here is broaden your viewpoint and educate others. When identifying a negative bias that makes you feel uncomfortable, learn about those ideas or that individual or that group and understand why that makes you uncomfortable. And then when you're making critical decisions, ensure that you invite people to broaden your viewpoint and to balance out any hidden biases. And then, if you identify a colleague that might be making a decision based off of their own biases, engage with them in a constructive conversation. Now, all that to say, just be sure to step back and just ask yourself, what biases might I have? What impact does it have in the workplace and to my colleagues and to my friends? And what will I do about this? Now, this is the million-dollar question. What is the solution to inclusion? And to be quite frank, I don't have the answer. But what I can do is share my experiences and what has been helpful to me as a person of color and a triple minority, and what other allies have done that have been so helpful to help pave the way. First, as a triple minority, when colleagues and friends ask me questions, that is so helpful. When they're curious about my experiences and my stories. Secondly, when they advocate for me because they're in the majority group. An example of that is, quite frankly, as a person of color of smaller stature, I get talked over quite often. And many times I'll try to raise my voice to make sure I'm heard. And sometimes that doesn't work. And so when I have, people that are in the majority group saying things like, hang on, she's speaking, let's hear her out. That creates space and that gives us the room to breathe, to speak, and to share. As allies, notice your patterns, understand them, and ask yourself the hard questions. Again, we all have biases. Ask yourself what these biases are and what you can do about this and how you can help support, the minority and the marginalized groups. Now, I know this is a big conversation and it's hard to kind of talk about and share so much in a short amount of time. So I'd love to continue the conversation. And with that being said, again, thank you to the Change Catalyst team. And if anybody wants to reach out for further conversation, please feel free to do so. Here's my information on the slide here.